This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Welcome to the Starlight Ballroom. Hey!
Hello and welcome to Shipwrecked and Comatose, the podcast about Red Dwarf on the Film Stories podcast network. And I'm pretty sure, because I've botched it on my other podcast, that I've said Film Studies Podcast Network a couple of times before, so if I have, I'm sorry. I'm just a terrible employee. Anyway, this isn't about Red Dwarf today. It's one of our specials where we sort of find a tenuous link to Red Dwarf and talk about something else. What we've done is we've picked something written by Doug Naylor. So we're looking at the 10%ers Series 1. And I've got a very special regular guest, I suppose. Welcome back, Rob Turnbull.
Hello, yes, thank you for having me.
For those of you who haven't listened to some of Rob before, why not? He's dead good. He's on some of our best episodes. But Rob, tell us about yourself and why you're here.
Well, I am here because I love Red Dwarf and I love do I love the writings of the Red Dwarf guys? I think we'll get into that. But I'm a sitcom aficionado and I have a podcast that I co-host called You Have Been Watching, where we look at British sitcoms, all the weird and wonderful. And this definitely falls into somewhere in the middle of that. So that's what I'm here. I'm here to lend my sitcom obsessed credentials to this assessment of Rob and Doug's lesser known works.
And that being said, I'm going to let you take over because you are the sitcom expert and I just really like sci-fi stuff that's over 30 years old. So go ahead, take the reins, mate.
Oh, well, thank you very much. So just to catch people up to speed. So we've already done a crossover that we did a while ago where we looked at the pilot to this. And I think we came away with kind of like mixed views on it. It's like, I found it funnier than I remembered, but it's darker than I remembered. And it's got some stuff that doesn't hold up, but stuff that did hold up. This show, straight off the bat, I'm going to say is actually quite different to the pilot. But if people out there haven't, do you agree? It's like the set is the same and the cast is more or less the same, but there's a very different vibe to this than the pilot.
The pilot, I think, main conclusion was that it really felt like they were trying to put absolutely everything they could in to get commissioned. And it worked, because we are now looking at series 1 of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think you're right that the series itself is a little bit less intense than that.
Yeah.
But, I don't know, I feel like there's a major character cut from the series, in as much as the wife character of our main, I'm going to say protagonist, even though he's a massive bellend, she doesn't appear. She's kind of like a Mrs. Mangle's husband kind of character, which I'm sure there's a term for. Is there a term for that, Rob? You're better at this than me.
Well, it's a bit like Norm's wife, isn't it, in Cheers?
Yeah.
Yeah,
yes.
It's that kind of thing. But this is the interesting thing, I think, when you look at the show. So it's like the pilot, she's a big part of that first pilot. And if anyone's not listened to it, go back and listen to it. You don't have to do the homework before you listen to this episode, but it'll give you a little bit of background, and we'll try not to repeat ourselves and what we said on that too much. But in the pilot, she's a huge part of the plot. The opening scene is her, and that kind of triggers the whole episode. And like you said, they are throwing everything at that pilot. In this series, for the first 6 episodes, she is this kind of constantly referenced sort of horrendous wife. This kind of, you get the feeling that she's a trophy wife, but she's, fiery. She's taken him to the cleaners. He's probably getting what he deserves, all this kind of stuff. But she's only ever referenced. And then in the final episode of this, which is basically a reworking of the pilot, we do see her, but we see her in a much smaller capacity, and she kind of arrives to basically sort of deliver the punchline, if you like, that she delivers in the pilot. So it's a very different relation. And like you say, having watched the pilot and then coming into this, it's weird because you feel like she's a huge character who's been removed.
What I thought was really odd was I thought that episode 1 followed on from the pilot rather than a restart because, you know, they referenced this character, even though she wasn't in it, she was Len Mangold. But that was when it became really odd that they rehashed the pilot, because I'd assumed, because, you know, all the fiery relationship, of course, was nudging towards the idea of a divorce between the two of them. So I assumed that this happened after the pilot, and then it hadn't.
I get that completely, because it's a weird one, because watching episode 1 of this, it does feel like it's carrying on from the pilot. Not necessarily in terms of the direct action, but in terms of the characters that we've had set up. In fact, I actually thought that the first episode of this, considering the fact that the pilot, people would not necessarily have seen the pilot when they sat down and watched the first episode of this. It's weird because the first episode almost relies on a familiarity with the characters that hasn't really been established yet.
Yeah.
Even though it kind of is established in the pilot.
And the pilot was aired, wasn't it?
I think it was aired, wasn't it? I'm pretty sure it was aired as one of those kind of the play of, not the play of the week, but when they used to do the kind of, you know, 7 pilots and, you know, 2 would get picked up and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But I think it was aired in a completely different slot. You know, it was a later schedule. It was, you know, stuck on a Thursday at 10 o'clock or whatever it was. Whereas this is far more of a sort of a Tuesday 8:30 kind of a vibe to this sitcom.
I think the stuff it does retain is that it looks fucking cheap.
Oh my God. And you know what? The fucking theme song.
Oh, they're changing the theme song. Why?
It's really bad. It's just so generic and bland, but it's so long.
The first theme was okay. It was nothing special. It did okay.
It was fine. Yeah, it was a bit like, you know, yeah, it did its thing.
But the new one's awful. Why the hell didn't they keep the original perfectly normal, boring one?
So tedious.
Yeah.
I mean, there are loads of boring reasons why music gets changed, because, like, music is the most complicated thing with rights. So there's probably they probably licensed some generic track to use in the pilot and they couldn't use it for a series. There'll be some very boring reason, but it's like they put zero effort into replacing it.
It's the one thing they should have fucking retained, and they didn't. The one thing they did return was that is something, again, that is very, very 90s. And you compare it to Red Dwarf that was created in the 80s. In the 80s, Red Dwarf had one fundamentally unlikable character. And the rest of them, whilst flawed, were likeable. The cat is funny and adorable. The Lister is a slob, but likeable and has a good heart. Crichton is neurotic, but a really kind human. Holly is quite sharp, but again, they are still interesting and fun. All of the characters in the pilot were unlikable, and all of the characters in the series were unlikable. That isn't a good thing to retain.
You know what? I think sitcoms based around unlikable characters can work,
Britass,
but it's really hard to make them work. And this show doesn't do it. But what's really weird, and we're gonna break down the individual episodes in a minute. We'll get to that, and so I'll touch on this a little bit more later. But the character of Tony, he is the American character in it, so like the American agent, played by Colin Stinton. He is the nearest we get to a likable character, because sometimes he is quite likable and sometimes he's a little bit slobby and he's a little bit more of a kind of an everyman and a bit more sort of almost a bit more of a kind of working class Joe. Yeah. You know, and he represents the kind of the low rent act. He kind of, you know, bad pop bands and strippers and kind of stuff. So a lot of the time he's fairly likable, and especially in the middle of the series, there's a couple of episodes where he's almost I would never say the sort of the moral compass, because they have a character who is meant to be that in the character of Helen. But there are moments where he's kind of likable, but then towards the end of the series, they just give him some lines and some dialogue where he's just a real shit, like a bit of a git. Yeah. And I think that's the problem, is that the characters fluctuate so much. Even in Dominic, who is like you say, the sort of main protagonist, which is Clive Francis, he gives a a brilliant performance. Generally, the cast are actually very good. The cast are pretty good.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And Clive Francis, I mean, he's kind of phoning it in. He plays these sort of sleazy, you know, posh, neurotic men quite well. But this is the weird thing. There are episodes where he's quite charming and you feel sorry for him. And then there are episodes where he's being really conniving and devious. And the show just never quite settles on any either. And like the character of Helen is obviously meant to be a bit of a drippy hippie, but she's like the nice one. The character of Atin, he basically is the git. He's the proper kind of like ladies' man sleazy.
Awful.
He is awful. And I think those two kind of like hold that position. They kind of stay there. Her being nice, him being awful. But the others in the middle, it's like the characterization never quite settles.
Whilst Helen is nice, and Helen is the kind of person I think out of everyone is most likely to be someone I would like, she isn't really treated sympathetically. She's a joke.
Oh, yeah.
Not a joke in a kind of comeuppance way, like sometimes happens with the other characters, but she is just the butt of a joke because she's kind, and I don't like that either, really.
It's a very, very 90s gag, and to be honest, it's very Rob and Doug at that time. I think both of them, separately and together, have matured as writers and they've improved as writers, but there's something, that idea of anybody showing compassion being an idiot.
Yes.
It's a very early 90s, kind of late 80s. You know, you think about how the 80s warped into the 90s and the things that we cared about, the things that we didn't care about. Obviously, a character like Helen today, you know, she cares about the art, she cares about the environment, she cares about people. These are all positive things, and we don't really make fun of those anymore. In fact, the comedy we would have now is people trying to be that. The comedy of a character like Helen, it would almost be like a Liz Lemon character where she attempts to be that and constantly fails. That's how we do that character now. In the 90s, that character is, oh, look at her, she cares about puppies and the rainforest and she's vegetarian. What an idiot. Ha ha ha. And it's really difficult because you have to contextualize. I will say, even contextualizing, even looking at the 90s and saying these are the things that we did or didn't find acceptable, it's still not particularly funny.
No.
It's like, you can look at some shows, you can look at Fawlty Towers and say to yourself, that was the 70s, we had different ideals, people had different understandings, but it's still really funny. This, you don't get away with that. You kind of go, well, it was funny to laugh at vegetarians back then, but these aren't good vegetarian jokes. That's what it comes back to. It's not give quiche a chance. You know, that's a good vegetarian joke. They nailed it with that one.
But I think, I'm sorry, I've got to have a dig. Looking at Fawlty Towers, that's what a lot of people used to think like. And John Cleese still thinks like a cunt. How could you possibly be that much of a legend and shit on it like that man has?
You know what I think, though? I think, only we're not talking about Fawlty Towers, so I won't bore people too much. I think that this applies to a lot of people his kind of age, is that you get, it's particularly men, you get men of a certain age who are usually, not always, but usually, who are very liberal and open-minded and left-leaning up to a certain point of education. And when they hit a certain age, they hit their point where they're like, okay, but that's a bit much. And that's kind of what it is. And I think John Cleese falls into that. And I think also he enjoys being antagonistic. So he sort of doesn't, he does, I'm not saying that it's all like an act, but he just will say things to piss people off. But I think it is this thing of, he is, again, by his standards, by the age that he grew up in, by the generation that he is, was very, very liberal and left-leaning. And it hits a point where he kind of goes, yes, we should do this. We should be open to that. We should be accepting of this. And then one thing comes along and he goes, oh, but that's silly. That's too much. And I think that applies to a lot of writers. I think you see a lot of writers, a lot of male writers who they are liberal and open-minded. And then they hit a certain point where they kind of go, yeah, but that's a bit too much. I can't be bothered with that. And it's all about education. I think our generation, my generation, I think I might be a smidge older than you.
Thanks.
The kind of the Generation X are kind of like the first generation who have constantly been re-educating themselves. I think our parents' generation, they hit a point where they just were too tired to keep educating. I think our children's generation, or the sort of our younger siblings' generation, the education was coming thick and fast, and so everyone was open-minded and accepting. But I think our generation are the one that are constantly having to re-educate themselves. And I think that the John Cleeses and similar, they just hit a point where they just were too fed up to educate themselves anymore. They thought, no, what I've learned, what I think is enough. I'm not going any further. Anyway, that's a whole other...
It definitely is.
a whole other topic. But I do think it's interesting when we're contextualizing older comedy to sort of bear these things in mind, that like where people are coming from and how open-minded they are to new ideas. I think someone like Doug accepts the fact that some of his writing is old-fashioned and doesn't hit the mark. But also, I think when you call him out on it, he gets a bit huffy.
Probably fair.
So Doug I think he wrote 4 out of the 7 episodes. This is basically a Doug project. Yeah, so Doug wrote most of the episodes, and then a couple of other people wrote the episodes in between. I mean, do you want to dive in? Should we talk about the individual episodes?
Yeah, let's do it.
We've sort of started to touch on the first episode, I think. Episode 1 of the series is called Sack, and that is written by Doug. And I mean, like you say, it's a weird one, because I kind of feel like we're meant to know the characters a little better than we do. And I think you can't assume that everyone's seen the pilot.
Yeah, I think so.
We have.
And the new logo was better.
I think the new logo is better, yes. A little bit of early, CG on the 10.
I liked Enid. She was kind of likeable.
Yes.
Was she a new character?
I actually now can't remember. I think she was new. I think because they had Gloria, who was the stuffy receptionist, and then they had the kind of the driver. It was like a chauffeur driver who wanted to be an actor.
Who got cut, didn't he?
Which is a shame, because that was a great character. I thought that gave you potential for that, almost that kind of like bunk scene type comedy. Somebody who just sits in reception on the off chance he'll get an acting gig, who won't go. That's instant gag. You can just have him throw in commentary on anything. So I thought it was a shame to lose his character. But yeah, I think Irene was a new character. They kind of doubled up on the reception characters. And yeah, Hilda Braid is always great.
I thought she was called Enid. Shows how much I did start losing the will to live halfway through this, I'll be honest.
Maybe she was called Enid, actually. I think I'm forgetting. No, I'll be honest. It's like I watched the first couple of episodes. By the time I got to the final episodes, I could barely remember the first couple of episodes. It was just such a blur.
There was a thing I wanted to look at with her. And I wonder, considering that, again, they'd been very gory and they'd made suicide gags in the pilot and then subsequently in episode 7 as well. Why didn't they pull the trigger with a dementia storyline for her and made it about pills? Because it was clearly implied that she had dementia, but they then said that it was pills that did that to her.
I mean, I think part of it is that they wanted to, because there are other moments in later episodes where she's quite savvy, and we see that actually she's quite clever and she's quite on it. So I'm not sure that they wanted to go with dementia. I think pills allowed them to make her scatty for that, very scatty for that one episode for a few good gags. And then sort of leave it open because, dotty old lady who's actually quite savvy is quite a good punchline in places. True. But also she's kind of, she's playing her stock character. It's the character that she played in Citizen Smith. Right. Basically, this kind of like lovely middle-aged or late middle-aged lady who just goes, oh, lovely. Yes. Oh, nice. Who has no idea what's going on, which she's brilliant at. And I think a dementia storyline would have been too much. I think pills, it's not that pills are funnier, but pills, there's more comedy potential, even though they don't really lead into it. I will say though, I thought that was a genuinely a brilliant payoff to the tea tray gag. This scene just opens and they're in a boardroom and there are about 5 full set tea trays on the board table. Nobody references it. And the scene just starts and they get, a few minutes into the scene with all these tea trays on this table. And then she walks in with another tea tray and basically says, oh, I've been taking these pills and I've got all forgetful. I nearly forgot, morning tea, and puts the tray down. I love a gag like that. I love it where the visual is set up, but nobody references it. And then you bring the punchline in.
And I guess the pills makes it less tragic.
Well, pills are less tragic. Yeah, I mean, it's like having an old lady who's actually mad.
I guess maybe I expected dementia because they'd gone so heavy in the pilot.
Maybe. I mean, I actually think it's the kind of thing that, again, if you were doing this show or sort of a similar show today, I think you maybe would go with dementia because it's this strange thing, isn't it? It's like, when does something unpleasant become funny? You know, when does it become okay to make jokes about certain diseases or certain disasters? It's like, is there a set amount of time? I think we're now in a position where we understand dementia enough that we're comfortable creating comedy around it.
Probably fair.
In a way that maybe we weren't back then.
Yeah.
I know that might sound a bit perverse. It's like, but the more comfortable, the more open, the more understanding we have about a thing, the more comfortable we feel, joking about it.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. So, again, I guess you're talking about how things have aged it, and maybe they would have been braver about dementia. Look out, Donald Trump hasn't aged well.
I know. I love it. I love Donald Trump references and things. It's like, Jesus. We forget that for decades, he was just a slightly sleazy, but let's remember, he was considered a good looking man when he was younger, this slightly sleazy, womanizing millionaire. You know, that's what he was for umpteen years. And then he was basically a game show host, and then he was the president, and now he's just this humongous blob of rage and hatred. But it's crazy when you watch things, you know, even stuff from like 10, 15 years ago, the casual references. I think it's the benign references. Yeah. It's like just a nice benign reference. It's like Donald Trump. Yeah, he's the most famous rich guy. So you just referenced Donald Trump.
I wonder if it would have been an Elon Musk joke if it was written now.
I don't think it would now, but I think 5 or 6 years ago it would have been an Elon Musk joke. I think Elon's gone too far crazy that you don't make those jokes about him anymore.
True.
It might be Steve Bezos. That's who it would be now.
Maybe, yeah. The other thing that ages it, I think, are the chimp jokes and the 3-2-1 jokes. But I laughed because I'm of a certain age.
Yeah, the 3-2-1. I was like, oh man, can you remember when 3-2-1 was well known enough to be an actual reference?
You see, I think that makes it funnier for someone like me that they're referencing something so shit and obscure now. That made it funnier, but that's obviously not the intent. Whereas the chimp joke, I laugh because, you know, the PG tips chimp. So even... No, it's massively dated as well.
It's weird though with the chimps thing, because the whole scene, I made some notes on that in particular. The whole scene I didn't think was funny, where Helen has been assigned a chimpanzee as a client and it's meant to show that she doesn't get taken seriously. I didn't find that scene particularly funny, where she's there and she's, you know, trying to pitch him to do a production of Lear or whatever it is. And, I don't really find chimps in things funny. I don't like it. It feels and all I can ever think is like that chimp could go mental and rip your arm off at any moment. So I don't like scenes like that. However, I thought the punchline where the chimp's handler just says he'll basically do anything as long as he doesn't have to drink any more tea. That was a great punchline for a very tedious scene. That was a really good punchline.
Tedious scene. Rob.
Tedious. We should be writing for Doug Naylor.
I did a funny.
One of the things that I do think dated it, and we'll move on to the next couple of episodes in a second, was the scene where he meets the Japanese businessman. And I feel like Japanese businessmen scenes are very old-fashioned. And it's a weird one because within the scene itself, it doesn't have any of that kind of weird, cringy racism that older sitcoms have. The butt of the joke is entirely the dominant character, and it's based on a very kind of like a simple misunderstanding that was set up earlier. And it has nothing to do with the Japanese people or their culture. No. It just has to do with Dominic's misunderstanding and his receptionist's error and a printer's error. And so there's this sort of like chain of events that put him in this situation. And because of his lack of understanding of Japanese culture, There's this scene where he's drinking some soapy water, and I actually found it really funny, just the physicality of it, of him drinking this soapy water. I don't know why. But again, the idea of like Japanese businessmen and they can't understand English and it all gets a bit confusing. Somebody does something weird. It's very old fashioned.
I agree. And the thing I noted from that particular scene was they're trying to find a new gazpacho soup gag. They clearly want some kind of soup-based lol. And it didn't quite hit the mark. Although, you know, I do wonder how they did it. Did he really eat a sponge, or was it like made out of, I don't know, rice paper or something?
Oh, there were a million things that they could have. I mean, it tore like a sponge.
It was a convincing sponge.
It was. He probably just pocketed it in the corner of his cheek. But there are a million things you can use to. Usually, when someone's got to eat a sponge, they make cake. You get a cake and you kind of dress it. I don't think this is the kind of show where they put that sort of effort in. I think Clive Francis just had to stick a bit of sponge in the corner of his mouth.
Fair.
So episode 1 then, I guess, how did you feel hitting it? Do you want to give it a star rating? Is it a 3 out of 5, a 4 out of 2?
It was an okay first impression. And I'll give it the benefit of the doubt because it's elderly. And the lift gag genuinely made me laugh. Yeah, it's just okay. There's nothing that upset me in it.
That's it, isn't it? There was nothing where I was left thinking, oh, this is horrendous. But I can't imagine watching it again in a hurry.
No.
You know, there was no kind of... Like you say, the lift gag was okay. I think it ran a bit long. Weirdly, these episodes, they're all about 22 minutes long, but most of them really... The pacing's awful.
And when you consider the first one was so fucking intense.
That's it. So much. I imagine that one of the main notes they had was like, slow it down, calm it down. And it kind of probably went too far the other way. So, second episode then, episode 2. This one is called Galaxy Quest 8, which is also written by Doug.
I did look up whether Galaxy Quest existed, the film, and it didn't.
No, it's about 5 years later from this,
I also looked up whether Sexaholics Anonymous exists, and it does.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it does. It does indeed, yes. Because I think they reference, don't they? They reference Michael Douglas in this episode in terms of like the sex... Because that was quite a big story for a while. This kind of like Michael Douglas made it okay to be a sexaholic.
No, it's fascinating. I did go down a little bit of a rabbit hole on Sexaholics Anonymous. It is basically exactly the same religion-based 12-step program that... I would never recommend people use for Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, because obviously faith is not the answer to your addiction. But, it's running exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, I think, again, we're sort of like jumping around the episode, but it's only 22 minutes. There is a scene, and I think it's the end of part 1 scene, where Atin basically, he's been so sleazy, sleeping around so much that one of their clients says she's going to leave unless he gets some kind of therapy for his sex addiction. And we see him and he goes to a Sexaholics Anonymous, and it's the most obvious. There's so many of the gags are like low hanging fruit where he's there. And I think there is a really good joke where there's this really nerdy guy and he's like, oh yes, if I don't have sex 3 times a day, I get these horrible headaches and I feel terribly ill. And they're like, oh, when did you last have sex? And he's like, 1976. That's a good gag. But then we cut to the next person to speak at this, and it's a really sexy lady with big boobs and a low cut top. And she's like, oh, I'm so, I just have to have sex all the time and I can't say no to anyone. And then the Atin character's like, hey, I think I'm going to like sex therapy. And it's such an obvious joke. Everybody uses that joke, and it's just having had such a good joke with I'm a sex addict, but I haven't had sex for like 30 years, to then have the very obvious horny lady and horny man are like meeting at sex club. It's like, it felt like such a dip after such a fun gag.
Well, fair. I think there is an extent that was probably the kind of gag that ITV wanted.
It's a very ITV gag.
Maybe they're pitching towards a certain audience, yeah. But on the flip side, one of their gags, I was like, well, I would go and see Brief History of Time, the musical.
No, I thought exactly the same.
But that was obviously a figure of fun gag aimed at the same audience we're talking about. But that being said, the lowbrow kind of idea, if you really are pitching at people who are less educated than perhaps you and I are, Rob, why would you make a reference to Stephen Hawking?
He's huge, though. I think it's like there's a random reference at one point to sort of Oedipus, which is quite a fun little joke. But I think people know Oedipus and they know Stephen Hawking. So I think we forget that he was like the physics megastar. But it's fascinating because, again, we're talking like 1994. What did we have then? We only had a couple of jukebox musicals back then, really. You had We Will Rock You existed back then. And there were a couple of kind of low-key ones like Return to the Forbidden Planet. But in the last sort of 20-odd, 30 years, there's been an explosion of jukebox musicals. And the idea of making a musical out of A Brief History of Time sounds like fun because the landscape is so different. We know that it wouldn't literally be that book done to music. It would be a clever, funny, irreverent, kind of postmodern story loosely based around it with some funky songs. And so we know that now. But back in 1994, those kind of musicals weren't really that prevalent. And so it makes a brilliant punchline. But yeah, looking back at it now, I was like, I would absolutely go and watch that musical. In fact, someone should pitch it. I wonder if Doug's still got the rights on that. It's kind of weird, this episode, though, because... And people might want to go and watch it, so I'm not going to spoil too much. But in this episode, Dominic's brother comes to visit, and he's basically this sort of like slightly cooler, slightly sleazier, works out in America, and he's come over and he wants some money back that Dominic owes him, and he's threatening to sell his shares, and the business will all go kaput. So there's quite a lot at stake in this episode.
Yeah.
And we see Dominic in a sort of a vulnerable situation, and basically he gets to be a little bit of a hero. Maybe hero is not the word for it, but he gets to triumph. It feels really weird because this doesn't feel like it should be episode 2. This feels like it should be episode 5. Like, the business is put at risk. We're introduced to a domineering sibling of a main character. This all feels like episode 5, maybe episode 4 stuff, not episode 2. And I'm genuinely curious as to whether these have played out of order, because there's no real kind of narrative through line to them, other than, I guess, the talk of the divorce with Dominic's wife and that sort of final episode.
That's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, there's no real kind of through line.
Again, it's another episode that's okay.
It's okay, yeah.
Good,
it's like,
it's not bad.
There are some nice gags in it. This idea that Atin has hired somebody to pretend to be an obsessed fan who comes and holds everyone at gunpoint. Yeah. That's a good gag. And then when the real obsessed fan turns up with a gun, but then it turns out that it's a second backup actor that he's hired. Yeah. That's a really good gag. And then the inevitable payoff with the kind of closing gag that the actual obsessed fan turns out. Like, that's a good gag. Absolutely predictable.
It works, though.
But acceptable. Yeah, it works. And also that felt very Doug. Well, let's say Doug and Rob. I appreciate that it's like where they were as writers at the time. But it feels very, Doug Naylor.
I also enjoyed Edith outwitting the rich guy. That made me happy.
That was really nice, yep. That was a good scene. It was, again, I feel like the pacing is a lot slower, but stuff like that is worth it. That was quite a long sequence to that payoff. She sort of tricks him into paying a large amount of money for some dirty water.
And I'd like to maybe look at the links to Red Dwarf. First up, there was the clear rehash of a Red Dwarf gag, naked on a snooker table covered in yogurt.
Yeah.
That's a clear reference to when the cast were trying to get Ace Rimmer into bed in the alternative reality. But that's fine, it's a good gag. And the other one is Galaxy Quest a dig at Red Dwarf?
Now, this is fascinating because I don't think it's a dig at Red Dwarf. Because it's real low-hanging fruit. They do some real kind of obvious sci-fi fans are all nerds jokes in this. And they have the character of Helen who tries to kind of justify and say that's unfair, that's a caricature, it's a cliche. And then they still kind of like cut her down. I don't think it's a dig at Red Dwarf. I think it's probably a dig at some of the fans that they've encountered, because by this point, the Red Dwarf fans were insane. And it's a very strange relationship, I think, when you create something like Red Dwarf, because you both love your fans, but you hate your fans because your fans hold you to this bizarre standard. And whatever you do, it hits a point that whatever you do, it will be wrong for someone. And the reality is what you're doing is what you want to do. I will never pretend to be like an expert into Doug's mind. But as people have listened to my show and listened to your show now, I worked on some Red Dwarf when it first came back to Day. So I worked alongside Doug quite a bit. So I have my own personal interpretation of the vibe I got from him is that he wants to do what he wants to do within the context of Red Dwarf. He doesn't want to simply do what the fans want. And there have been a couple of times that he has done what has been implied to him that the fans want, and they've not liked it, and that's pissed him off. And then I think he's hit a point now where he just does what he wants to do, and if the fans don't like it, he just doesn't give a shit. And I suspect that's a little bit of what this is. This sort of like, for one, like you say, maybe it's an ITV audience, it's low hanging fruit. It's like, he's got this hugely successful sci-fi show, but it's still funny to take a dig at sci-fi fans in the 90s. It's still, we're still making fun of Star Trek at this point. So maybe it was just that Red Dwarf wasn't even in his head and he's just doing a few sci-fi fan jokes. But I suspect there was that little bit of dig back against the entitlement that some fans have, I suspect. Although there is that point where the Tony character, who is meant to be a fan of the sci-fi show that they're referencing, does basically do the Rimmer salute.
Yeah, that was the other reference.
It is basically the Rimmer salute.
Yeah, it's definitely the Rimmer salute. But again, if you're going to rehash a joke, rehash one of the funniest ones.
Exactly, because anybody who has not watched Red Dwarf, and there will be a lot of people who watch this show that didn't watch Red Dwarf, that's just like, oh, that's a bit funny. Anybody who did watch Red Dwarf, and I watched this at the time because I was a Red Dwarf fan, would go, no, it's like the Rimmer salute. Yeah.
And that is a good way of getting both, isn't it?
Yep, you get a double whammy. I kind of liked this episode. I thought the structure was quite good. I thought it had a couple of really solid woofer gags, but it did feel out of place. Like, genuinely, I would have liked to have seen this episode a couple of episodes later. How much of that is a valid criticism, I don't know. That's just my sort of feeling on it.
Fair.
So when we hit episode 3, this episode is called Small Packages. This is the first episode of the series that isn't written by Doug. This was written by James Henry. I had some very strong thoughts on this. What were your thoughts? I suspect we're going to be on the same page, at least with this opening scene.
So there were some attempts at feminism that really hit the mark. A really dark joke about how a story about a woman's struggle, eventually a man was cast to play the character. And I thought that was really, really good.
That is a good joke.
I just found that they ruined it with a gender roles joke, and that was tiresome and fucking stupid. And yeah, it's a shame because it was close to being good.
It was, and I don't know how much. Like I say, this wasn't written by Doug, this episode, but I don't think that Doug gets off, because I think in his previous writing, again, not so much now. I think he has grown up, but he and Rob have been responsible for some fairly misogynistic writing, or at least misogynistic jokes in the past. And, this is his show. Doesn't matter who's writing the episode. He was in charge of this show. This episode throughout just feels really misogynistic. It's got fat jokes, stripper jokes, plus this whole sort of plot line where Atin, it's sort of at the beginning, some woman turns up that he's had, a one night stand with, and she turns up with a baby. It's quite a funny joke, the initial joke, where she puts a bag on his desk and said, oh, you left this at my place last time you stayed over. He opens it up, there's a baby in it. Okay, that's a good joke. Yeah. But then there's this whole thing where he thinks he has a kid and he has to look after it. This woman stormed off. They kind of ask him, did you not use protection? And then there's this weird scene where he's basically saying he was really drunk and he tried to, and he accidentally put a condom on a broom handle. And then they just had sex. And it's weird because it's, again, 90s sensibilities. I get that. But it's not very funny, and it's too close to you're too much in the ballpark of non-consensual sexual activity with that kind of thing, that it needed, I don't mean that being funny makes it acceptable, but it needed to be a funnier joke.
So let's make it clear. This was unpleasant and misogynistic, but I don't feel like it's as bad as Crikey TV. I'm still fucking traumatized from rewatching Crikey TV and going, at some point I watched this and didn't think it was one of the most gross things that's ever been broadcast on the BBC. This was yuck. There were some very unpleasant jokes, and it is about almost kind of aggrandizing corporate shitbaggery as okay, but it's not as bad as Crikey TV, so I'm not going to give it a pass, but it isn't the worst Doug's ever done.
Yeah, again, not to go off on one about a different show. I think that the difference for me with Crikey TV is that I think that was trying to do a thing and didn't necessarily do it well. I think that's the difference. I think that Crikey TV was trying to be a man not understanding things, and that was where the comedy was meant to come from. But unfortunately, the comedy came from the wrong. Yeah. The subject became the comedy rather than the foil, if you like. So I think it's just that's just a messed up potential and opportunity. Whereas this, I don't think there's a strong enough attempt for let's say the misogynist to be the center of the gag. I think that there is misogyny and then there are misogynistic jokes. Whereas I think in Crikey TV, I think the misogyny is meant to be the comedy, but it's not well written enough for that to be the comedy and the misogyny to be the gag, if that makes sense. Again, Doug didn't write this episode, but he still put his name on it. He still produced it. He will have script edited it, I'm sure. It's just that very 90s sleazy, isn't it? It's like, we wouldn't make an episode like this now. They wouldn't make an episode like Crikey TV now. Everybody involved would kind of look at it and kind of go, ooh, no, that's a bit, we switch this about. But it's strange because I feel like so much of that is concentrated in this third episode.
True.
Like the previous couple of episodes and the later couple of episodes don't really do this as badly.
True.
They don't get quite, there are a few fat jokes and a few kind of, but this one is, it's just really sort of concentrated misogyny. Basically, I didn't like it.
No, me neither. And also, there was an odd moment where they seemed to think that a bungee jump was a worse fate than a tattoo of Valerie Singleton. Any tattoo that you don't want is permanent. A bungee jump takes 20 seconds and then it's done. That wasn't a gag. That made no fucking sense to me. And I'm trying to avoid going way too far into the misogyny because I've done that so many times on Shipwrecked and Comatose. Everyone knows my opinions.
That whole sequence where Dominic's basically sort of like getting off his face trying to impress a wild boy actor, it's just weird because they've obviously tried to go for like weird things. It's not just like getting shit-faced and trashing a hotel room is not interesting enough. So it is kind of like weird tattoos and bungee jumps and stuff. I think they just were trying to look for silly things. I mean, bungee jumps, I guess in the mid-90s, bungee jumps were very popular, but also something that not a lot of people had done. So I guess maybe it was a bit more, but like you say, tattoos. I mean, my God, if I got drunk and did a bungee jump or got drunk and got a tattoo, I know which one I would be regretting.
Yeah, exactly that. Made no sense. And if we're going to do something else positive about the episode, it was a perfectly acceptable comedy of errors, classic misunderstanding kind of sitcom vibes with the opera singer. That was quite fun.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that scene was quite good. Yeah, again, a bit slow and a couple of fat gags in there, unnecessary. True. But yeah, it was like a decent kind of like, there was a line in there, I can't remember, I think it was in reference to Dominic, where, what is it? It's something along the lines of he's acting more strangely than a menopausal herring in a Gary Larson cartoon. I thought that was a decent line. It was a very Red Dwarf kind of line.
It was, but maybe I just, by pure luck, get all of the cultural references in Red Dwarf. There were a couple that I clearly missed in this.
It's a weird one, isn't it? Because there are going to be cultural references. It's like any show, you know, how well it ages. And I think stuff like 3-2-1, we hear 3-2-1, it's like, fucking hell, even by 1994, I think 3-2-1 was
exactly.
done. But anybody younger than us is not going to get 3-2-1. Anyone in their 20s will hate this show. But anyone in their 20s is going to watch this, and they are not likely to get a 3-2-1 reference. They might get a Kathleen Turner reference. They might get a Gary Larson reference. But it's a strange mishmash, isn't it? It's like... And like you're saying about, you know, brief history of time, whether that was a common reference or not, how easily people would get it. I think there are strange things in this show where Doug is just pulling. I mean, again, I know he didn't write this specific episode, but Doug is just pulling from everywhere. Yeah. You know, it's a lot calmer than the pilot, but he's still just pulling from everywhere and throwing stuff at the wall.
And it shows the difference between once you're comfortable in a sitcom, like Red Dwarf at this point, compared to having to set up a new one. And it simply isn't as good as Red Dwarf ever was.
It's funny, you know, so you saying that, because watching this as a series, I was struck by how much, and this may not make any sense, but perhaps with our, you know, the You Have Been Watching audience, we've kind of touched on this before a little bit. This show feels exactly like a show written by somebody who has a big, huge, successful show. There's almost like this subgenre of sitcoms that somebody does next, which isn't as good and only gets a couple of series. Simon Nye has done it, and, you know, Ben Elton has done it, and obviously, you know, Rob and Doug have done it. All these people, they write a show which becomes huge, big success. And then it's like, right, what do we do next? And they do another show, and it's fine, but it's not good.
Yeah.
But they all feel the same, all those shows. They all feel the same. It's like kind of ramming characters in, and this show has too many characters. There are too many characters. And you get characters just meandering and floating around. You could have cut 3 characters from this, doubled a couple of people up.
And what's really odd is they cut the fucking chauffeur. And they cut the guy who sat in the reception. But then they added characters. So they cut the wife as well.
It's such a... Like, in this, I think, realistically, Atin and Tony could be combined to make one character.
Yeah, I'd have said that. And the receptionists could have been combined.
The receptionist only needs to be one character. You know, Helen and Gloria, that's great. You know, the career-minded, selfish woman and the, you know, the hippie, drippy, love the world woman. That's fine. Keep those 2. But yeah, one receptionist, Tony and Atin, combine them. That would be enough. That would be enough. You know, I missed the guy sitting in reception. That was a good, you know, like I said earlier, I thought that was a good sort of comedy potential, but fine. Get rid of him. Or have him as a recurring. You know, there's a guy in this who's like an office junior, and he has about 3 lines across the whole series. A big guy with the long hair. You know, you could have turned that into the guy who sits. It's a weird, messy show, and it just screams second project.
Yeah, it does.
So let's get off this. I mean, I think we both agree that episode 3 is just unpleasant.
Yeah, let's move on.
There's just, despite a few decent gags, and again, I think the cast are solid. But it just really doesn't play very nicely. Episode 4 is this is the second episode not written by Doug. And I have just forgotten what the name of episode 4 was, but it was written by Steve Punt. So Steve Punt, obviously solid comedy writer, you know, involved in a lot of the same kind of projects, radio projects that Rob and Doug were involved in. It's not bad, actually. Because it opens with a kind of a fake TV show.
Yeah, it's a cold open. And that really was striking compared to the rest of the season, that they only did it once, but it had meaning because it was like, wait, am I watching the 10%ers? Oh, here we go.
And that's what the whole, like, instantly I was like, this is another level. We've got this cold open. You've put a bit of money on screen creating a fake TV show. It's, you know, we obviously recognize the genre, we recognize the presenter this guy is mimicking, you know, we know what this is. And now you've put us into this world where this exists. You're not just telling us. And that's what the whole series needed. The whole series needed fake movie trailers. It needed fake theatre performances because they're not using real actors or artists. You know, they reference Arnold Schwarzenegger a couple of times. Kathleen Turner gets cruelly referenced.
Yes.
It needed either to be real people or you needed to establish who these fake people were. And this episode does it brilliantly because you have this fake game show, you have this fake Jeremy Beadle character, and instantly we sort of buy into the rest of the narrative. Yeah. We buy into the rest of... Plus, it's funny, the idea of this like really shitty Saturday night BBC show called Celebrity Underwear.
Did you really have to refer to Celebrity Underwear as shitty?
Well,
That's not an image I wanted,
You
mate.
know what these celebrities are like? The amount they get up to.
It's satire, and it's good satire. I liked it. It made me smile. It was silly satire.
And it's a really good cold open gag because the entire cast of characters are sat there watching this saying, oh my God, this show is awful. It's terrible. What a ridiculous TV show. And then someone tries to turn it off and they all go, no, I'm watching it. It's a good gag. It's a good cold open gag. Elevates this episode, I think, in terms of, as cheesy as it sounds for a 1994 ITV sitcom, the world building is on point here. And that's what elevates it.
Yeah. And I think this probably is one of the strongest episodes. Ironically, wasn't written by Doug.
Yeah.
But the Barry character is another vile cunt that you just can't like. Dropped into a cast of vile cunts. I get that the industry is vile, but I need someone to like.
You know, there is a second series of this, which I don't, I watched it. I haven't rewatched it for this. I don't remember it that well. I don't know how much the characters develop. I feel as if our main characters, our protagonist characters, the agents, I don't think they're meant to be as unpleasant as they are. And I think that that's just a mixture of not quite finding the characters yet, the writing sort of not quite leaning into the right places. You know, like I said, Atin is clearly meant to be the bastard, and Dominic is meant to be not a bastard, but he will do bastard things. You know, he will sell his morals down the line. But I don't think it's established enough. I think the idea of a show where the celebrities are all awful is fine. I'm okay with that if the celebs are basically all awful. But like you say, the other characters are not likeable enough, at least at this stage. Yeah. They're not likeable enough. What I did really like in this, though, I love the fact that the story that kind of gets Dominic into trouble is in the Private Eye. I love that it's in Private Eye.
Yeah. Why did they go for Private Eye rather than the Mail?
Just because I think it's a bit more interesting, and actually I would argue, because I was watching it, I was thinking, I really like that. I like the fact that it isn't, the Daily Mail, because that's what you would think, a big story in the Daily Mail. But actually, I think that a story like that, the Daily Mail don't care about. But Private Eye do. That's the kind of journalism that Private Eye actually engage in. And it's the kind of thing that Private Eye publish, this kind of, overheard in the Ritz bar or whatever it is,
True.
So I really liked that. I actually thought that was sort of realistic, actually, that it would be something that Private Eye would pick up on, because the newspapers just wouldn't actually care. Not until it became big. Once it became big and it became a court case and there was libel involved. Also, don't forget, especially in the 90s, Private Eye were constantly getting sued for libel. Like, that in itself was a joke. True. So I really like the fact that it was Private Eye. And also, agents, all those kind of people. I mean, I read the Private Eye because I'm a London media elite wanker. All those kind of people, they all read the Private Eye. I don't know why I'm calling it the Private Eye, but they all read Private Eye. So I really liked that about it. I thought and all those sort of cutbacks to the court case and showing the kind of the court artist renditions of Dominic in like silly dramatic positions. That was great.
That was the best gag of the entire series.
Honestly.
Was the two dramatic images of the courtroom. They were The best gag, by far. I laughed and I thought, well, that's really fucking creative. And I really enjoyed that gag.
Yeah.
The best part of watching 8 episodes of this tat.
Genuinely, really funny. Like the image where he's basically draped over the witness box is kind of like, picturing it now, because that was a really funny image. And I thought,
So funny.
the pacing of this episode was so good. Like, compared to the other episodes where they felt a bit sloppy, a bit slow in places, I thought the pacing was really nice. That kind of back and forward. And again, it was the using of media, the kind of fourth wall breaking in this. We opened with that cold open of a TV show, a fake TV show. And then at several points in this, we cut to a news report, which is delivered to us, like straight on, as if we were watching the news. And that's quite nice. And it kind of, the texture of the episode is different. And I just wanted to see more of that. I just wanted to see more of that throughout the series.
I liked the attack on law culture and lawyer culture. I thought that was really good. I missed a breath when I saw an Elvis character, because it could have been Clayton Mark, but it wasn't, thankfully. For people who don't know, Clayton Mark played Elvis in Red Dwarf, and he is a vile, vile fucking pedo. That would have really ruined the best episode for me if Clayton Mark had turned up. But I think it's accurate how they explore the bullshit of law and how rich people can exploit it.
Oh, yeah.
And there was one line that wasn't supposed to be funny, but boy, oh boy, it was like a gut punch. Principles and integrity means no money.
Yeah.
Welcome to my world. Great episode. If they'd all been the quality of this episode, this would have been a great series.
Yeah,
it
agreed.
Was in general okay to not great. I've watched worse for this podcast, and that would be A Prince Among Men. But this episode was really, really good. Maybe Steve Punt should have been the lead writer.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It's like, and as much as I said with the previous episode, Doug shouldn't be off the hook because he probably did do some script editing. I think also Doug deserves some credit for this because he put Steve Punt in there. And again, he may have done some script editing. We don't know to what extent they worked together on it. But I think you're right. It's like Steve Punt is a very good writer. This whole episode is kind of like very much in his ballpark as well. It's the kind of stuff that he does and has done for a long time. I think it shows it's a really strong episode. Like you say, if there'd been a whole 7 episodes of this quality, then I think that I would be looking back on this more fondly. Whereas it's one episode like this, which kind of elevates the series. And then the rest of the episodes kind of have, they have their moments and stuff, but there's a consistency to this episode that really, makes it the best one.
Yeah.
So episode 5 is called Feud, and we are back with Doug for this episode. And basically now for the rest of the episodes, they're all written by Doug. Weirdly, actually, I thought that this episode brings that little bit of darkness back in. And perhaps the characters are a little bit nastier here. And again, I don't know whether that has anything to do with the order these were written in, because there's no kind of progression to it. But if you think about in the pilot, they were all a little bit nasty. This episode, I feel like they are a little bit nastier, whereas in the first couple of episodes, they seemed a little bit softer. So this is just my own personal musings, whether perhaps this episode was written earlier. But like, there's a joke right at the opening about members of Rockstar. Tony has a rock band, and the members just keep dying. And Dominic's kind of like, they just keep dying, choking on their own vomit. And he's like, this, how many members have been killed with their own sick? Yeah, it's really dark. I mean, it's quite funny, but it's really dark. Just this idea that they're constantly dying on their own vomit.
It does feel like they haven't quite got where they're pitching the darkness across the season.
Exactly. And I feel like weirdly, the earlier episodes, the darkness has lifted. It's not quite as dark as, and I don't mind dark. I'm all in. I love a bit of dark comedy as long as it's well structured. And I think the problem here is that it wasn't, the pilot's really, really dark. The first few episodes of this aren't particularly dark. And then suddenly it feels like we get back into the dark again, not as dark as the pilot, but we get a little bit of darkness, like an entire band choking on their own vomit.
Yeah. And, you know, the super glue gag was a guilty laugh for me. That wasn't dark, but that was what I'd kind of got to expect, because it's been dark, it's not been dark.
Yeah.
But the super glue gag was great fun. I really enjoyed that. I'm not sure I enjoyed the darkness in this episode, but I normally like dark stuff.
I think the problem is, it's not that I didn't enjoy the darkness, because like you, I enjoy dark stuff, but it's dark comedy is the same as slapstick comedy. You can't just have someone fall over and it be funny. Slapstick comedy is actually quite sophisticated, and you need to know how to create it and structure it well in order for it to be funny. And it's the same with dark comedy. You can't just have somebody say something dark and nasty and it be funny. You need some structure to it. And I think the many band members choking on their own vomit, I like that joke in principle. It's a little bit like a sort of a twist on the old Spinal Tap. The drummers keep dying in various ways. It's sort of in that ballpark. But the episode and the series doesn't really put you in a place to expect it. And I think that's why it doesn't quite land the way that it could.
Yeah, and Spinal Tap did it much better, let's be real.
Oh, absolutely. Spinal Tap did everything better. There is a nice joke in here somewhere that there's this, again, I think it's the opening scene with Helen. She's talking about one of her writer stand-up comics that she's repping, and the fact that he's spent months and months carefully, meticulously rewriting his improv show that he's going to be doing for Channel 4. That's a great...
That's a good line. As
somebody who works in comedy and stand-up comedy a lot, that was very, yep, that's the way it is. And I do wonder sometimes how many of those sort of jokes are Doug kind of having a dig at actual individuals.
I can believe it. I definitely can believe it. I don't know why I didn't notice it before, but I finally added to my notes. Oh, it's quite formulaic that they have a meeting at the start of each episode. And again, the only episode that didn't do that was the best one.
Yeah, and it's weird because actually I don't have a problem with the formula of opening with a meeting. I'd be okay with that, because there are other shows that kind of do that. You know, The Vicar of Dibley, a lot of episodes of The Vicar of Dibley, they don't necessarily open, but they very quickly, you hit the village hall meeting. Even Dad's Army, quite often an episode will open up in the little side office before we move out into sea. There are lots of sitcoms that have this kind of formula. And considering the context of this show, I have no problem with that being the opening scene, particularly if you've had some kind of a cold open. Earlier Red Dwarf, quite often you would have some little, not necessarily a cold open, but you'd have some scene that would set up a threat or a danger or something. And then you'd have a bunk scene.
Yeah, exactly that. I was about to say bunk scenes.
Exactly. So I don't mind the boardroom scenes, except that the show as a whole doesn't quite structure them. If every single episode was a cold open, like the previous episode, and then credits, and then boardroom scene, it's formulaic, but that would work. I would like that.
Yeah,
I think that would work.
That
but
makes...
basically, I think the cold opens, that was needed. You know, those kind of like establishing what this week's episode is, establishing what this week's world inhabits, whether it's a TV show, a news report, or a fake movie trailer. That's what we needed. That's what we needed to open every episode. Then a boardroom scene, and then you go into whatever else is going to happen.
Yeah, but this was actually a good episode. I'm bitching about the boardroom scenes not really being good enough. And I think I agree with you. As a concept, I quite like them. But they were never quite good enough. It's almost felt like they got a list of gags and they didn't know where to put them. So they put them at the start of each episode and just dripped them in the boardroom scene. Which is fine, because some of them were funny, some of them weren't.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
This episode's good. This episode is good. I like the dig at people who make ridiculous demands. That's something that everybody knows about within show business. It's nice and accessible. And the comedy of errors was fun. And gags about toupees are very 90s. Do you know what? Maybe if I'd have been born 20 years earlier, I'd have worn a toupee and I would have thought it was more dignified than walking around with no hair. I don't know anyone really No, I don't know anyone personally. And the only famous toupee wearer that I can think of is Donald fucking Trump.
And this is the thing, I think that toupees, in terms of being like a full-on headpiece that somebody wears, two things have happened. One is that it's a lot less common because a lot of people just go, fuck it, shave my head. Or you can actually get very effective hair implants, which if someone's got the money and the time, that genuinely good results. And then a lot of people, you know, actors and stuff are more likely to use a small hairpiece, like a little something that goes on the top just to fill in a gap. The idea of like the full head toupee, as it were, people don't really do that anymore. And the people that do it, the quality is just insane. You just don't know. The last time I saw somebody with a very obvious bad toupee was about 15 years ago. And I was on a steam railway for a Christmas steam railway journey, and there was a local vicar who must have been about 90, and he got on the train to lead some carols, and his hair was white grey except from the top where he had this bright orange straw monstrosity with like hair clips holding it in place, and we were just meant to pretend and ignore it. And that's kind of the gag that this show is doing, because that priest from 15 plus years ago had obviously bought that toupee in the 1950s. It probably looked very convincing, and he'd never replaced it. And then it hit the early 2000s, and he was still wearing it. And to be fair, it wasn't actually that funny. It was a little bit sad. But toupee gags, they're a dying breed, aren't they? Nobody does them anymore. I quite like the surrealism of it as well. The idea that this guy who is embarrassed and uncomfortable about wearing a toupee is accidentally sent to a hotel where there is an entire convention actually celebrating toupees. Like there's a guy singing a song. We love toupees. We all wear our toupees. Like I love the silliness of that.
Do you know what? As a person who has lost their hair, I really hated it. I really, really hated it. I resented it. I was a metalhead with hair down to my arse, and then I had no choice but to not be able to have long hair. And I hated it. But I would look really weird with a toupee these days. I've shaved my head since I was 27.
That's it, isn't it?
And that's nearly 20 years. So I don't know. I quite like people who have the hubris to bother with hiding the fact that they've lost their hair being mocked, because I was brave enough not to, despite the fact I didn't fucking like going bald. Who does?
Yeah, it's a weird one. I'm fortunate. I have, thick hair. Even as I get older, there's no kind of thinning. My grandfather, lived well into his 80s and had a thick head of relatively dark hair, with no work or treatment to it. So genetics are kind of on my side in that one.
You have the hair that I would like at my age. I think I would probably be as undignified in my 40s as you and have my 20s hair. Yeah. I think I would. But, I know people who have gigantic penises. I don't have one of those either. And this is just what happens genetically to me. Anyone who tries to do anything that just be you. Just be kind of happy you've got life.
This is the difference, isn't it? This is where we are now, is that we are more, and like I was saying earlier, without getting too overly spiritual about it, our generation, I think, very much are the generation who have had to constantly educate themselves and adapt to these things. So you're saying there, you lost your hair when you were young and you didn't like it, but now you've embraced it and now you're, comfortable with it. Or, I don't want to say that that you wouldn't want it to be different, but you're comfortable with it. You're okay with it. And as a society, we're okay with that kind of thing. Whereas the younger generations, I don't think it even would faze them. Someone in their 20s now, if they start going bald, I think they just go, yeah, I shave my head. That's what happens. It's like, or they get plugs or whatever it is. I think that these strange kind of social stigmas, the kind of attitude that means that you do have an entire sequence in a sitcom on primetime TV all about somebody going to a toupee convention and being embarrassed. That doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And for us, we were older teenagers when this came out. And we probably would have watched that and gone, oh, yeah, it's toupees. Isn't that embarrassing? And like you say, I think mocking the hubris of wanting to hide that is a fine thing to do. Whereas now, as adults, we watch that and we're kind of like, why, that's no big deal, you know?
Yeah.
If someone wears a toupee, we just let them do it and we get on with it, but they don't need to. They can shave their head and we accept that. So it's all very different. Again, we always come back to on this podcast about taking things in the context of the time. And you know what? Weirdly, the end point of this story, the moral of this story, is that the guy who's going bald basically says, how ridiculous, I need to embrace this. And he discards his toupee. So maybe in some way, Doug Naylor, he paved the way for bald men everywhere to be comfortable.
Yeah. But it's a good episode, and there's nothing wrong with something that mocks someone's hubris.
No, not at all. There's one element to this that I was a bit kind of like, ooh. It's a kind of a classic farcical. I mean, the whole episode is deliberately trying to be a farce, and it does better and worse in other places, you know, because this main character is a film director who has directed a farce that has flopped. And so obviously they're kind of like mimicking that idea by doing farce. There is a sequence, and it's a classic mistaken identity, where Dominic is meant to be breaking up with another client's mistress, but accidentally sits at a table with the film director's wife. And when she thinks that her husband is leaving her after she supported him, she then decides that she wants to sleep with Dominic to get instant revenge. Now, it's fine in terms of that kind of the comedy of errors of it. The only thing that got me is that Dominic doesn't want to, and she really pushes it. Like, she gets really, really pushy. And it's not just like he says, oh no, I couldn't. It's like there's quite a lot of the scene where he's resisting sleeping with her. Now, and then he does sleep with her, and then he can't walk properly. But it's like, it's a bit weird. I don't know. It was just a little bit too pushy for me.
I think it's supposed to be a flip of what you'd expect. That it would be a sleazy man pushing it with a woman. I don't think it's very sophisticated, personally. I agree. But I guess you do have to have some kind of resistance in something like that. I agree, it's odd. I do think it's odd.
I think really it's just that there's a little bit too much resistance. I think especially if she had been very vampy, and because we as an audience know that she is acting on misinformation as well. So it's a bit like she wouldn't have done this had she not been given this misinformation. So it's a little bit, again, like a lot of this show, you know, in other episodes before and after this one, there are lots of little moments where I think that it's the 90s attitude, and it's maybe it needed to be a little bit funnier to make something a little bit questionable ride better. And I think that's all it really comes down to, I think. And perhaps if she had said, oh, I want to sleep with you, and he'd said, oh, no, I couldn't. She'd said, no, I really want to. And then we'd sort of cut to him going, oh, and then next scene, that would have been fine. But there was just a little bit too much backwards and forwards of him saying, no, I really shouldn't. No, I can't. No, I mustn't. Well, I'm going through a messy divorce. I can't sleep with you. It just felt like there was a little bit too much of that. But yeah, overall, I thought this was a solid episode.
Yeah, I think so.
So we've got the 6th episode then, which is called Awards. Like I say, this is written by Doug.
Oh boy, the start of this episode.
Oh, this was a very unpleasant start.
So you've mentioned it briefly, and
yeah,
just the Kathleen Turner thing. I'll be honest, I had to look up who she was. And
oh wow, okay.
For people who didn't know, she is a celebrity actor who was originally very slim and society's idea of beautiful, who put on a lot of weight. And I thought the jokes about that were fucking rancid. It
is a horrible opening sequence because it's like, I don't like fat jokes. I hate fat jokes. I just don't like fat jokes. And at the time, it was a big thing that people were making jokes about Kathleen Turner because she'd put on weight. And so I'm a huge Kathleen Turner fan, love Kathleen Turner. And exactly as you've said, for people who don't know, she was very classically, she's the voice of Jessica Rabbit, and she was the voice of Jessica Rabbit because they wanted a voice that sounded sexy, and she played very sexy characters. She was quite an old school Hollywood type sexy. And then in the early 90s, she put on a lot of weight. And part of that was genuinely to do with illness. And obviously Hollywood, particularly back in the 90s, was not very pleasant. And everyone kind of went, fucking hell, Kathleen Turner's put on a bit of weight. Now, we don't care about that. I never cared about that. People shouldn't care about it. We can contextualize. It was the 90s. People made a big deal about it. Jokes about it were made.
Yeah.
But in this, it's horrendous. It's not just a skinny woman got fat joke. It's just this extended sequence where the Dominic character is talking about, I'm sorry I'm late, but I was at dinner with Kathleen Turner and it took 5 hours. I never thought she was going to stop. She's like, starts doing like pig.
Horrible.
It's
horrible.
It's nasty. It's nasty. And, we talked about, there was the previous episode with the singer and again, the mistaken identity. And there's a fat joke in there. Again, not funny. I don't like fat jokes, but at least that was basically this woman's, she's talking to the Tony character and he says, oh, what character, what parts do you normally play? And she says, oh, I usually play the romantic lead. And he kind of looks at her and says, oof, to be realistic, I don't think that's going to happen. You're a bit on the big side. It's not nice. It's not funny.
No.
But that was it. It was like, at least that's all it was. This is just horrendous. It's a horrible sort of assassination of her character.
Yeah.
And at least with the previous fat joke, you could sort of put that back onto Tony. Tony was being insensitive. Tony was misunderstanding the situation, and the person he was being fattest towards got to retort and got to leave. So at least there's that at play. Whereas this, it's just picking a famous woman who is put on weight and just attacking. It's horrible. Yeah.
It's vile.
It's really unpleasant.
And even if that wasn't enough, the character that I've written literally every episode so far, Atin is a douchebag on my notes. So I've not said that for every episode. And I wrote Atin is a douchebag. And then I wrote, delighted he got his comeuppance. Ah, fuck, he got away with it. And I just want this character, the guy that is clearly supposed to be the piece of shit. Even the other characters that aren't supposed to be the piece of shit, leave them to one side, even though they are pieces of shit. This guy is clearly written to be a piece of shit and get his comeuppance. Rimmer regularly gets his comeuppance when he's a bellend in Red Dwarf. Atin never gets his comeuppance. And I get that is a comment on show business, but it isn't enough. He needed some kind of comeuppance at some point, and he just didn't get it. And this is where I thought he was going to.
Well, this again ties into what I was saying about feeling that the Tony and Atin character could have been combined. Because I feel like if Atin had moments of conscience, then you could sort of let other elements fly. It's like the character of Rimmer. I love Rimmer because he is such a git. But also the show, Red Dwarf across the years has done so much work in examining why Rimmer is a git. And why Rimmer could not be a git if things had been different, nature versus nurture. And he has these moments of heroism and he has moments of decency. But like you say, he always gets his comeuppance. So Rimmer is such a well-rounded, interesting character. And he's so much more than just being a git. Whereas this character is just a git. Yeah. I have to say that I did really like the joke of him, getting up, pissing his chips away, leaving, and then before he gets out of the building, realizing that it's a mistake and coming straight back in and saying, see, that's what could have happened. I do quite like that. I like the kind of, somebody quits and then comes in the next day pretending that they hadn't really quit and they were just having a hissy fit. I do like that as a gag, but I know what you mean. It's like, you feel like you're going to have a whole episode which is Atin failing, going away and failing, but he doesn't. He gets away with it and he comes back in and they're like, oh, thank goodness. Phew, I was worried. But I do quite like the actual gag that delivered that, even though it was, like you say, disappointing.
Yeah. The thing about this episode is it doesn't quite sit right. They have the actual Jonathan Ross, and they make a Phil Collins reference, real people. But instead of Roger Cook, they create Brian Sharp referencing Roger Cook. That makes no sense. Don't reference Roger Cook and have this character. Or have Roger Cook. That really boggled my brain. I was like, what are you playing at?
I actually would say that this is the one instance where I think it works. But generally, I think that's an issue with the show, is the kind of the mixture of fake people and real people. But actually, I think in the context of this episode, it's fine because he's meant to be a shitty Roger Cook. He's a big part of the plot is that he is not as good as Roger Cook. And so I think that works okay. I think if you pretended that he was Roger Cook he was the Roger Cook of this world. So Roger Cook doesn't exist. He is the guy who does that instead. I don't think it would have worked because Roger Cook actually did a good job of things. I think in this case, you did need to reference him because the whole point is that he's like a low rent, crappy version. It's like a surprise. He couldn't possibly have won this award without it being rigged. So I disagree with you on this particular episode, but I do think that is an issue throughout the series. This mixture of real and fake characters.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, but I think this could have been done with Roger Cook, and it would have had more impact if they did it with Roger Cook.
I think there's a strange thing with this episode, though, that I actually really liked, and previous episodes dip into this. And this episode in particular does it, and I would have just liked to have seen a lot more of it. Again, with the stuff that we talked about in episode 4, the Steve Punt episode, I would have liked to have seen more of what that episode was doing. This episode actually gets a little bit Yes Ministry at times, with Clive Francis kind of like meeting people and these kind of like little machinations he's got going on where he's sort of setting things up here and they're just having meetings. You know, there's a great scene with Don Warrington where it's like, if you scratch my back, I scratch yours. I really liked that element in this episode, in this story, because again, that there's a flavour of realism about it. And basically, I quite liked seeing them being good at their job.
Yeah.
Which you don't really see in other episodes. In other episodes, they mess up or they get lucky.
Yeah.
And that's what it comes down to. They mess up or they get lucky. And you think, how is this a huge why is he having lunch with Kathleen Turner when he's not very good at his job? Whereas in this episode, he is good at his job and he kind of plays the game and it kind of works in his favour, even though he gets a comeuppance at the end. So I like that in this. And again, I would have liked to have seen more of that throughout the series.
I think so. I do want to talk about Don Warrington's character, actually. It makes the Kathleen Turner gags all the more irritating that it was a really positive queer character with a really positive queer gag. It was like, oh, you're gay, only since the day I was born.
I love that line.
And that was played for laughs and it was funny, but it was also very much a statement of this is what queer people are. We're here and we aren't deviants. We are people who were, forgive me for quoting the wonderful Lady Gaga, born this way. And that was a really good, positive gag that just got it right. The gay character was strong. The Dominic character wasn't actually homophobic. He was just dumb. And it worked really well. In the same episode where they laid on the fat jokes. Just why? Why?
Yeah, no, I agree. I really like that. And funnily enough, because I watched this show, when it first came out, I don't really remember it very well. But throughout certain episodes, there were little bits that flash, a joke or a scene or a sequence. And that scene with Don Warrington popped up and I sort of remembered that. And yeah, you're right. It was a really nice little positive moment because the joke of Don Warrington being gay isn't that he's gay. It's that Dominic has just completely forgotten everything about this man.
Yeah, exactly that.
Like he's just forgotten. So he's like, oh, how's the wife? It's like, I'm gay. It's that element, that's the joke of it. It's like, oh yes, of course you are. It's not an issue. It's not a problem. It doesn't get in the way of anything. It's just a simple fact. And because it's such a big thing about a person, it's a funny thing for someone to have forgotten.
Yeah, but what's really nice is the way that Don Warrington's character is really confident and isn't ashamed about being gay. He goes, I'm gay. He doesn't go, I'm gay. It's great.
Yeah, no, it is.
And it's really frustrating it's in the same episode as the Kathleen Turner gags.
Yeah, because you cut that Kathleen Turner gag out of this, and the episode in general is quite funny. It's not, I don't think it's the best of the series, but it's quite funny. Like I said, I really enjoy the kind of yes minister conniving element of it. It's quite a funny joke where Dominic he sort of sets up lunches with 4 people that he needs to schmooze, and by the end of it, he's really drunk.
Yeah.
That's quite a funny visual gag.
Classic sitcom shit.
Classic.
In fact, they did it in Vicar of Dibley. Maybe they nicked it from this.
Let me think. Vicar of
Maybe
Dibley.
It was
I think that might have predated. Oh no, it would be about the same time. Actually.
Yeah. So it's very similar to that Christmas dinner gag, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's it's funny stuff. Not hilarious. Not watch it again and again, but doing a rewatch for this, it's like, yeah, it's funny stuff. But all of that is sat on the top of that opening Kathleen Turner gag where you just like go, bad taste in your mouth.
Yep. Shame.
So we are nearly done, thank goodness. Because, like the bastards that they are, they added, this is a 7-episode sitcom.
No, I've never seen the like of this before. I was like, there's a 7th episode, are you sure?
It's such a strange thing. I mean, back in the day, sitcoms used to be a little bit more erratic with their episodes. So it's not unusual to find something with 7 episodes or 8 episodes.
Is it?
Even some stuff. Yeah. It does. Well, back in the day, it used to be 13. 13 episodes used to be quite a standard back in the 60s and 70s. And then it kind of like shifted, and by the 80s, 6 had become the standard. But you would still get random shows, I think like an earlier series of As Time Goes By, I think might have had 7 episodes or something. But some of it does come down to the fact that if you had a really good pilot episode, you could broadcast it. If you had a really good pilot episode that had very few changes, you could broadcast that, but the commission is still for 6 episodes. So you got 7 episodes to put out.
Okay.
And then, there are other reasons, the way that money gets used, the way that money gets spent. So it's not unusual to have 7 episodes, but it actually feels unnecessary because the previous episode 6, the awards episode, that feels like a perfectly decent place to finish a series, an award show, because that's what these people are aiming towards. But what we actually get is this final episode, which is a kind of a rehash of the pilot.
Yeah, and I don't get it because there's no need for it. The pilot was okay. It was really fucking gory. And this is really fucking gory. And it, again, after 6 episodes where it wasn't gory, I wasn't expecting it. And I was like, they've used that joke. They've used that joke.
Yeah.
I don't understand why they didn't just reuse the pilot. It really is that.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of watching it, trying to figure out if they had just spliced in some stuff from the pilot. Because that, again, is something you quite often will find.
Oh, like a clip show kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah. And you'll see, if you ever watch the first episode of Green Wing, it's hilarious because they made a pilot for that. About a 20-minute pilot was made for Green Wing. Then it got commissioned, becomes like a 45-minute, hour with break show. But that very first episode, because they shot additional material, from scene to scene, the actor's hair gets longer and shorter and all this kind of stuff. But they don't mask it. It's just in that opening episode. And again, you see that occasionally in other sitcoms. You'll have a first episode where they've reshot some of it. And so people's hair changes a little bit. But in this, as far as I could tell, they didn't reshoot anything. I think the graveyard scene might have been reshot. Might have been the original from the pilot. Well, I was trying to sort of watch, but to be fair, the quality that I was watching of it, I couldn't quite decide. Yeah,
well, I assume we both watched this on YouTube, and the quality isn't great.
Yeah.
That's worth mentioning, actually, that I can't find series 2 anywhere, so we might not be able to do series 2 of the 10%ers. So if anyone's listening that knows where we can access it, that would be lovely. Drop us a message at Red Dwarf Pod on Twitter.
Yeah, I realise, like, Doug might be listening.
Maybe.
I'm sure he's an avid listener to both of us, so...
I hope not. I've slagged him off.
Other opinions on Doug Naylor are available. Yeah, it's a weird one because they reshoot so much of it. I think it is a better version of the pilot story.
Yeah.
I think they tighten it. It's not as frenetic. It's not as erratic.
Well, they've got less characters to play with, haven't they?
They've got less characters. The wife character, Dominic's wife, we touched on it briefly earlier. She's kind of in the background for the previous 6 episodes. So when she does finally turn up, it's I guess it's kind of a culmination of that. And when she attacks Dominic in this, she stabs him with a Statue of Liberty. And it sort of works because basically she's in an office, she's in Tony's office, and because he's American, his office is just full of weird American shit that no American would want in their office. And she sort of angrily grabs a Statue of Liberty statuette from his desk, threatens her husband with it. And there's quite a nice gag of her holding it. It's like, what are you going to do? Stab me with a miniature Statue of Liberty. Scene cuts. We see her leaving the office, comes back in. Another character joins him and he's bleeding. And he's like, oh, she stabbed me with a miniature Statue of Liberty. It's a well-played gag. Yeah. Whereas in the pilot version, apart from the fact that the opening scene is her beating the shit out of him with a gargoyle on the motorway, she turns up at his office with a knife and basically just stabs him. And again, dark comedy. I love a bit of dark comedy. Go back and listen to the episode to see what Mark and I and the other guys thought of it. We won't retread that here, but it kind of works better here. Most of the gags from the pilot work better here, I think, because they're just a little bit more controlled. They're a little bit more, I guess, nuanced in as much as this kind of comedy can get nuanced, but it still feels a bit unnecessary. Yeah. And what I didn't like at all was that there were some gags that were funny that they reused. There were some gags that were okay that they reused. There was one gag, and I'm sure you know which one I'm going to mention, that they shouldn't have fucking used at all. And that is the joke about someone taking their own life. That isn't funny. It's not okay. And even in it was the 90s, I cannot see how joking about someone who has a mental health problem to the point where they take their own life, I don't understand how that was considered funny. I don't understand why anyone would have ever laughed at it. And I don't understand why a writer would have thought it was okay. Because even in the 90s, surely we weren't that fucking primitive. See, I find it weird that it's in an ITV sitcom. That's what it seems weird to me. Because that kind of gag and the visual of that gag, of the sort of these legs hanging and somebody walks into an office and they're just hanging there. Vile. That feels very Channel 4. It's a very Channel 4 sitcom. It has that vibe of sort of Paris. It's the kind of thing that you might have seen in something like maybe The Young Ones, or it's not quite Blackadder level, but that's the kind of joke that I would expect to see, or the place that I expect to see that kind of joke. Maybe in a Comedy Strip Presents kind of a project. It feels out of place in an ITV sitcom. It feels weird because it's so dark and so surreal. And that's where it feels odd for me. It's like, I'm surprised that ITV said, oh yeah, we'll have a suicide gag. Twice. That seems weird, That seems weird. Yeah. I, to some extent, struggled with 8 episodes of this in an afternoon. I think if I was watching it on a weekly basis, it would have been less difficult to swallow. There's some good in this, actually. And I think, as a curiosity for Red Dwarf fans, it's worth watching. As a sitcom connoisseur, what did you think? As a sitcom connoisseur, I think it is a very weak sitcom. I've said already, I did watch this at the time because I was a Red Dwarf fan. So I watched this at the time. I watched Captain Butler when that came out. I watched that weird thing that Norman Lovett did with a talking dog. I watched all of the kind of Red Dwarf adjacent shows. I watched them when they came out because I was a Red Dwarf fan. And I watched this. it didn't stick in my head. Weirdly, Captain Butler has stuck in my head more than this did. Maybe because it was only a few episodes and because it was a bit more surreal. But it's not something I would recommend. On this podcast, we're big into the weird stuff and the stuff that gets forgotten. So from that perspective, I think it's quite fascinating. What's weird though is that you look at shows like, so I mentioned Paris, actually. That's a good example. That was one of our earlier episodes that we did. So Paris is a show that Graham Linehan did kind of after Father Ted. And it's not very good. It's really bad. And then he sort of goes on to the sort of bigger and better, regardless of who he is now. We're talking contextually at the time.
Yeah, we can all say that he's a massive cunt and move on from that.
Yeah, it's like detestable man. I met him once through work a few years ago and deeply unpleasant. But Paris is an interesting oddity on his path because you can look at how that didn't quite work, but other things did work and where he goes to next. It's a bit like a show like Hippies, which we also covered, which has Simon Pegg and a whole other of all those kind of, Darren Boyd, all those kind of people. And again, you look at how that is an interesting oddity on their progression, on their path. The thing about the 10%ers is that if Doug and Rob had gone on to do something after Red Dwarf, then this would be an interesting stepping stone. But the reality is that they did Red Dwarf, they did this was not very good. It didn't get commissioned past the second series. And then they go back and do Red Dwarf again. Well, Doug does. Rob does. God knows. So it's a weird one because it makes it feel like more of a failure. I don't think that's fair because I think that Doug in particular has always loved Red Dwarf. And I think the idea of basically just making Red Dwarf forever is something that makes him happy as a writer. And that's okay. I think that's okay. And that's where he is. And that's what he's doing. I don't think that him going back to Red Dwarf was a sign of failure. I think that this was just something he was doing in the middle. And if this had been a huge success, he would have continued to make Red Dwarf and Steve Punt would have written more episodes of this. That's the reality of it. But because they did Red Dwarf, paused, made this, it's a bit shit, and then they go back to Red Dwarf, it makes this feel like more of a failure.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, I think it's just a quirky little 2-series sitcom, which is sort of okay, doesn't age very well, and is not one that I would watch over and over again, but it's fine.
Oh no, I wouldn't watch it again. I'm glad I watched it as a curiosity. I'm not sure, with hindsight, I'm glad I watched Prince Among Men. I'm not sure, with hindsight, I'm glad that I watched Captain Butler, because they were both... they weren't as good as this. I
think that's true. Prince Amongst Men is utter shite. Like I watched that at the time. I watched it at the time. I actually stopped. Like I watched a few episodes and I was like, this is just shit. I couldn't watch that. Captain Butler, I don't mind Captain Butler, but it's very, very Channel 4. It's very of its ilk, of its genre. I think this probably is a better sitcom. I think this probably is better written, better performed. I think it probably is better from that stance. But Prince Amongst Men is like way, way lower down for me. It's like if I sort of put this in terms of like non-Red Dwarf projects, if I put this at number 1, Captain Butler at number 2, Prince Amongst Men is like, number 17. It's like it's so far below these. But yeah, it's fine. I wouldn't recommend it just for the lols. If you just want something to give you a good chuckle, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this.
Maybe episode 4.
Yeah, maybe episode 4. Maybe maybe watch episode 4, see what you think, and then go back and watch the others as well. I wouldn't start with the pilot. I'd maybe go back to the pilot. But yeah, you don't need to watch these in order either. There's no kind of coherence to them. I think it's funny enough. I think Clive Francis is very good. I enjoy watching him. I think he's very good. He does more with the character than is on the page. And hopefully we will get to look at the second series and see how they've progressed and see whether the things that we're criticising this for they might change that. They might sort of lean into some of the things that maybe every episode of the second series has a cold open.
Yeah.
Maybe Steve Punt writes a few more episodes. We're not sure. So it'll be interesting if we get the chance to properly, because I don't remember from 30 odd years ago. So it'll be fascinating to see whether the second series is just more of this, or whether they've tweaked it or adapted it in the ways that we feel it needs.
Well, if we can find it, we'll do it. Fortunately for us, we could never find series 2 of Prince Among Men. So, Rob, before we go, where can people find you on the internet?
The easiest place is always Twitter, where my personal account is Forducks, which is FORDUCKS, or you can find the podcast, which is YHB Pod, at Twitter. Whatever it's called now.
Yeah. And if you're looking for me, it's at MarkAdamsHC on Twitter. You can also follow my Instagram, but I don't post anything other than wedding shit on that. So thank you for joining us for another episode of Shipwrecks and Comatose. And until next time,
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast, was created and produced by Mark Adams and Kurt North. You can find us on Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod, and we are part of the We Made This Podcast network.